Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. We are GPS, and we're doing the 7 trumpets, and we're glad our guest has been here now for a couple of weeks. We've got him in a 3rd week, Ganem. We hope it won't be long until you can open up an afternoon. And if the 2 women come back to us, we can make you here, Ganem, make 5. It's a blessing, and we give honor and respect. I was with Wesley James the other night, looking at what they're doing in India with LLBN. Right. I just got an email today. They're going to have 4,000 crusades or campaigns next year in India. So we should do something with LLBN and that. I'll go be your emissary. So I just heard about that this morning, and I said, boy, I got to be a part of that somehow in my next episode of my life. Anyway, we honor what you're doing all over the world, in the Arab world.
It's a blessing. It's a true blessing to know that at this time and age, we can be an instrument to share the gospel throughout the world.
Yeah. And you came to us and said, Pastor Dan, we've enjoyed Flame of Truth. I've got 100 shows in LLBN, which they still show. If no one else, my mother watches it every night, who lives down the street here in the villa. But I hear others who say, that's what they watch. But here now we've shifted gears and have 90 shows where we've done on Revelation. And so thank you for dreaming about it, and we're happy to have had a chance. I don't think any of us thought we would be doing at this pace. We thought we'd be done probably by now. But we're doing this thoroughly. We're doing it carefully. And we have, I think, number one, the other people who write about Revelation have all learned from him. That's how lucky we are to have Dr. Jon Paulien with us. Anyway, we'll give a few flowers while he's here to hear them. I want to go back to something that you said, John, as we're looking at the background of these trumpets, and that most people don't really respond long-term from negativity. And Ellen White talks about that the motivators of the soul are faith, hope, and love, not fear and shame and guilt. But we have talked about this in our last day event scenarios, that as, yes, the truth goes around the world, there will also be disasters. And when people are hungry and there's no food in the stores and there's disasters, that there will be a heightened interest in spiritual things. And there will be debates on who the true God is and where did we get away. And we believe there will be some laws passed in light of disasters that have occurred, that maybe it's because we've drifted away from God. We need to get people back into church, and we'll make some laws, right? That's part of our scenario. And then we will have to stand up like Daniel's 3 friends and say, we're not accepting. We will protest. So is there no place for disasters here at the end of the world that will help wake people up? There will be truth spoken, and there will also be evil manifested. And both combine to say, maybe I've been a little sloppy in my not dealing with this. And they now deal with it, and they do wake up, and they do respond, and they do come. And there's this mass influx, partly because of the truth about God, but partly because they finally realized that the earth was not as stable and as long-term viable as they thought. Possible or not?
I don't think there's any doubt that the Bible fairly consistently portrays the time of the end being a difficult time, that there'll be, weather issues, environmental issues, things like that. I don't question that at all. The question is that what the trumpets are about?
Okay.
When you go through the trumpets and you look at the language and see it in its biblical meaning, is that where you end up?
Okay, and that's a separate question.
And I would say that the first 4 plagues are very much what you're talking about. They seem to be literal, even I'm saying that. They seem to be end time, after the close of probation. They seem to affect the quality of the water and the air and things like that. So even within Revelation, you have some clear texts that speak directly to those issues. I'm just protesting taking the trumpets, which seem to have a different purpose, and reapplying them as if they were just a repeat of the plagues.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay, but, because just when you said that no one wakes up from evil, I said, it seems like our last day event, eschatological scenarios do include those kinds of scenarios.
God uses dramatic events to get people's attention, but the goal is not a respect or a following that comes from fear or awe or something else. What God is looking for is a response of love.
Amen.
And a relationship.
Even when the pigs got driven over the cliffs, people didn't come and say, okay, now we see Jesus, come and let's be your followers. They said, could you leave our area?
Parents will yell at a child that's about to cross a busy street, try to get its attention and turn back from that. That is a very loving act. But the act of yelling at the kid is not what stimulates relationship and long-term love.
Well, I see people who get a wake-up call with a bad diagnosis, diabetes or cancer or heart trouble. And boy, they start juicing and they're walking and they're okay. They got the gospel for, like you say, 2 weeks. And then there comes the cookies, and then pretty soon people go to Weimar. I love Weimar. I was up there a few months ago. What a great place. And people get well at Weimar. And they walk on the trail. There's 15 miles of trails. But when they come back, they're not walking 15 miles anymore or 5 miles. And pretty soon, they got to take the medications back, and they backslide from where they were. So I understand what you're saying. So where the balance is. Anyway, we are ready to go to the second trumpet. We hope that you'll have a Bible, and Ganem has his tools. Are you ready to say something more?
Well, yeah, a question. I mean, so God is God of love. And it is hard to imagine that God will bring pain and sorrow to his people. Yet in the Bible, it speaks of that. I mean, it had came through many generations. You know, the Israelis were constantly attacked by others, on, and it brought many miseries, death, and agonies for them. But still, does God bring the harm on us, or is God give Satan the opportunity?
We've talked about judgment a number of times in the last show, so that's a good question.
Well, you have a number of texts of judgment in the Bible. In many of them, it talks about God's going to, smash this, and he's going to destroy this and burn that up and so on. And then later on in the passage it says, but God gave them up to the consequences of their own disobedience. So it interprets the active language of judgment as something more passive. God is not out there with a baseball bat smashing everything up. That's an image to get our attention, but in actual fact, God is sadly giving us up for the consequences of our behavior. Now, there are plenty of judgment texts in the Bible that don't have that qualifier, that just talk about God doing this, 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 and this. So the question, which even Christians can disagree on, and even Seventh-day Adventists disagree on, is do you take the texts that don't qualify the judgment and apply the qualification to them too? And for some people, God never judges, God never punishes. That's just not in his agenda, in his vocabulary. And therefore, they would take the texts that talk about giving people up and saying that applies to all the others. Others would say, take the Bible as it reads. If it says that he gives them up, he gives them up. If it says that he smashes this, he smashes this. And if those who remember Loma Linda history, a fellow named Graham Maxwell, who I think powerfully influenced a lot of people in talking about God and the character of God, he sort of was in the middle on this. And he did believe, for example, that the flood story was an active intervention of God, and that the Assyrians and some of those other things were active interventions of God.
Emergency measures.
Yeah, and he called them emergency measures. God acted in an emergency, just like a parent yelling at the kid who's about to cross the street or about to fall off the cliff. Under the emergency, the parent yells. Does the parent love the child less? No. He's trying to save the child.
And doesn't want to be considered in that picture for the rest of history.
And parents, obviously, now and then, do a little bit of this, in most cases at least. I had a couple daughters that didn't really need much of that, but I had a son who needed more than I was ready to give. And, he turned out to be just the sweetest guy, so you never know. But as parents, sometimes you have to intervene strongly to keep them from hurting themselves.
How do you see Babylon? Let's take that as an example. Was Babylon an evil power which came out of evilness to oppose God's people? or did the Holy Spirit impress Babylon to come as an agent of God to take them into captivity?
Well, I would understand the exile as the consequence of Israel's rebellion. God said, if you obey me, all these good things will happen. If you don't, these negative things are going to happen. There were greater powers than Israel that would have wanted to eat it up over the centuries. And I believe God prevented that. God frustrated the aims of these evil powers. But when Israel no longer wanted God, you want to go it alone? Okay, like Pharaoh, Moses says to Pharaoh, let my people go. Pharaoh says, over my dead body. God replies, have it your way.
But Paul says God hardened his heart.
Yeah.
So is it God doing it in Pharaoh, or is Pharaoh of his own evilness and God allows it and uses it to do some wake-up calls?
Yes.
All of the above.
Because
God did not soften his heart.
Yeah. 5 times in Exodus, Pharaoh hardens his heart, and 5 times God does. And the two actually are an interaction. If a person's in rebellion against God and God shows up and tries to woo them, that tends to provoke even more rebellion. And then they get further away. So every time the gospel is presented, if people are drawn to it, they come closer to God. But if they resist, they get driven further away and they're harder to reach the next time.
So here's a question you may have two answers for.
Yeah.
Does God take interest in individuals or in nations?
Yes.
Okay, that's what I
Yeah, the biblical answer to most questions, I say, is yes and no.
Yes, all right. Okay, so let's now go to the second trumpet, Revelation chapter 8, verse 8. Everyone there? You're there? Mm-hmm. Okay, here we go. The second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a huge mountain, all ablaze, was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea turned into blood, a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed.
Okay, once again, you just look at that and you say it's all pretty clear, and it doesn't mean anything to me. Just what on earth is going on here? Well, once again, the key to understanding Revelation is to go back to the Scriptures, go back to the earlier revelations. And repeatedly in Revelation, hundreds and hundreds of times, the book of Revelation uses the language of the Old Testament to make the points that it wants to make. Where in the Old Testament do you have water turning into blood?
And the plagues.
Again, the plagues of Egypt. Very first plague of Egypt was Moses turning the Nile River into blood. And then Pharaoh's magicians doing the same, turning water into blood. Let's look at that. Exodus 7, Dan, verses 19 to 24.
Exodus 7,
19 to 21.
19 to 21.
Mm-hmm.
The Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over the streams and canals, over the ponds and all the reservoirs, and they will turn to blood. Blood will be everywhere in Egypt, even in the wooden buckets and stone jars. Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord had commanded. He raised his staff in the presence of Pharaoh, and his officials struck the water of the Nile, and all the water was changed into blood. The fish in the Nile died, and the river smelled so bad that the Egyptians could not drink its water. Blood was everywhere in Egypt.
Mm-hmm. So there you see this water turning into blood. That is in the trumpet, recalls the first plague of the Exodus. But there's more. And this is a text you probably don't know. Jeremiah 51. And keep in mind, what do we have here in the second trumpet? We have a mountain on fire. Fire seems to be a common denominator in the trumpets.
Falling into the sea.
Yeah. You remember that Revelation 8:5, it says, he took the censer, filled it with fire, and threw it to the earth. And we're not sure if the it refers to the censer or the fire.
And nothing grammatically settles that.
Grammatically, it could go either way. Yeah. The nearer one actually is the fire, So if he's throwing fire to the earth, it keeps appearing in each of these trumpets. So that fits actually very nicely. So this burning mountain is thrown into the sea. And as a result of that, the sea becomes blood, and the fish die, and ships are destroyed, and so on. So what's going on here? Jeremiah 51, verse 25.
I am against you, O destroying mountain, you who destroy the whole earth, declares the Lord. I will stretch out my hand against you and roll you off the cliffs and make you a burned out mountain.
All right. So there you have Babylon is a burnt out mountain. So you have the image of God's judgments on Babylon coming in to this particular text here. Dan, 41 and 42 of the same chapter.
41, 42.
Yeah.
How Shishak will be captured, the boast of the whole earth seized. What a horror Babylon will be among the nations. The sea will rise over Babylon, its roaring waves will cover her.
All right, so Babylon is this burnt up mountain and it falls into the sea and the waves cover it over. Now you notice it said Shishak instead of Babylon. Couple things you need to know. In the ancient Hebrew and Aramaic languages, they're consonantal languages. Is Arabic the same way? Is it based on the consonants rather than the vowels? I think so, yeah. So that still exists today. So Babylon is like BBL. Now, one code that the ancients loved was where you reverse the alphabet. So the first letter of the alphabet becomes the last. So you're writing in code, nobody will understand it. So B is the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and Sh is the second from the last. So Babylon, BBL, becomes SHSHK, Shishak. So you've reversed the B into the next to last letter, and then the K and the L get reversed in the middle of the alphabet.
My note here says Shishak is a cryptogram for Babylon.
Yeah, you see?
Cryptogram.
So it uses that reversal of alphabet way of writing the code. So this is all the same Babylon. Babylon, the burnt up mountain, falls into the sea and gets covered with the waves. And Dan, read 63 and 64 of the same chapter.
Reading all that, interesting. Okay, we're at 63 and 64?
Yeah,
Hang on. Where are we? Okay, when you finish reading this scroll, is that it? Mm-hmm. Tie a stone to it and throw it into the Euphrates. Then say, so will Babylon sink to rise no more, because of the disaster I will bring upon her, and her people will fall.
So what's Jeremiah 51 about? It's the consequences to Babylon for hurting God's people. God permitted Babylon to conquer his people, but Babylon enjoyed the task a little too much. And then God's judgments come back on Babylon itself. So the language of the second trumpet is the language of the fall of Babylon and the fall of Egypt. It combines both of those. So you have God's judgments, but this time against the Gentile nations. Remember, in the first trumpet is God's judgments against his own people, and we worked through. It took us some time to figure out how that would work. And then here, it's God's judgments on the pagan nations. And it talks about the fish in the sea dying, and ships being hurt, and so on. What sea is this in the second trumpet when the burning mountain falls into the sea? What was it in Jeremiah 51? The sea was the Euphrates River.
Yes.
Babylon, it was a twin city on both sides of the Euphrates River. And the prophet predicts a time when Babylon will just be rooted up and tossed into the river and come to no significance. It's portraying the downfall of Babylon as a city and as an empire. So the question is, to whom does Babylon refer in John's day? Who would John call Babylon?
Rome.
Rome. Okay, Rome is also a city on a river, the Tiber River. And he's predicting that Rome itself will soon come to an end. You have, for example, 1 Peter 5, verse 13. 1 Peter 5:13.
She who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you her greetings.
All right. Was Peter ever in Babylon? Not that we know of, but we know that he was in Rome. And if you go to Jewish apocalyptic around this time, there are multiple references to Babylon, to Rome, but they use Babylon instead. You can see they're describing Rome. They even have series of emperors, and you can name the emperors, but it's Babylon that is in view there. So Babylon was a term that the Christians used for Rome. Proof of that is Revelation 17:18.
Revelation what?
17:18.
Oh, that's chapter and verse.
Yeah. So Babylon is a major player in Revelation 17, but notice what John says in the last verse.
The woman you saw was the great city that rules over the kings of the earth.
Okay, rules there is present tense. So when John wants to identify Babylon, he says this lady, this great city, is ruling over the earth, present tense. So Rome of his day was a principle that would reoccur at the end of time. The Babylon of Revelation is a combination of ancient Babylon and contemporary Rome and all of their characteristics as hostile to God and all the rest of that. So Ganem, you're looking at me like the wheels are turning. What's going on?
No, you're making great connection. Obviously, the Babylon the Bible referred to can apply to any empire in any time of age in history. And there will be another last Babylon in the last days that would be fallen again and be fallen before Christ.
Yeah.
Very interesting points, though.
Some people would be disturbed by the idea that John is referring in chapter 17 to a contemporary Babylon.
Right.
Okay? Because Revelation 17 is part of the 7 last plagues. So it appears to be end time. You see, so now, we're coming back to that issue. What's end time and what's not, and how do you know? One very important prophetic distinction is that in a prophecy can go anywhere and any time. The prophet can travel anywhere, anytime. Daniel 2 takes the prophet all the way to the end of the world and experiencing the destruction of the world and the setting up of God's kingdom. So within the vision, the prophet's traveling through time.
2,500 years.
But when the explanation comes, it comes in the prophet's time and place.
Right.
So Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold. After you comes another one. After him comes another one, et cetera, et cetera. And then comes the stone that is cut out without hands. So that is a distinction. In Revelation 17, the prophecy is the first 6 verses. And there it talks about Babylon, the harlot sitting on a beast and dominating the world. That is end time. But in verses 7 to 18, the prophet comes to explain the vision. And he says, by the way, this Babylon that we're talking about, you can see what Babylon is like right now in the empire that's ruling over you right now.
So you've got Babylon and Israel. Both are basically
They are now metaphors for the people of God and those who oppose him at the end of time. That's
How do you
right.
tie in Pergamon where it says Satan, where Satan rules or Satan has his seat? How do you tie that to Rome or Babylon?
How do you tie it?
I'm searching.
You're searching, okay. That's okay.
It's the note here in my Bible says that was a seat of emperor worship.
That is true, and that is one interpretation of that text. The one that I like, and by the way, I was riding in an elevator about a year ago with an author who did his dissertation on the images of Ephesus and Pergamum, you know, and he was going through the different ways you interpret the seed of Satan. And I said to him, you know, I says, I read your book carefully, and it convinced me to take the position you didn't agree with. So that was a fun elevator ride. But my understanding is when you go to Pergamum today, you don't see anything. There was a great altar there once, and it could be seen. It was 1,000 feet in the air, so it was like a beacon on top of the Empire State Building, and it was known in the whole region as the altar of Zeus. The reason you don't see it there is because it's in Berlin. The German archaeologists came in the 19th century and just packed the whole thing up and took it home. It was better than the Parthenon in Athens. And if you go to the Pergamum Museum, it even uses the name, the Pergamum Museum in Berlin, it was East Berlin during the divided times, and you go to that, you will see this incredible altar filling a gigantic room. It's amazing, and I wish we could just pull a picture up right now. But that is an amazing piece of work. So it was recognized by the Christians, evidently, that at that time, that altar there represented to the real degree the actual presence of Satan in that context. Well, let me finish something with a couple minutes left. What is this all about? I would suggest that the second trumpet represents the fall of Rome. And it's prophesied in more detail in Daniel, but you have a hint of it here. If that is the case, what do we have here in the first two trumpets? We have God's judgment on the two powers that crucified Jesus. It was an interaction between the leadership of the Israelite nation and the empire, the Roman Empire. When Pilate and Caiaphas got together, it was over for Jesus. The priests would have loved to have destroyed him a long time, but they did not have the authority to do so. They needed the cooperation of the empire. And they got that when Pilate finally agreed to participate and to condemn Jesus to death. So you have in the New Testament, the central act of the New Testament is the cross of Jesus Christ. And the cross occurred because both political and religious authorities of the day united to destroy Jesus. At the end of time, Revelation 17, the political and the religious powers of the world will unite against the people of God, the faithful people of God. And so the scenario of the cross replays at the end of time.
But in terms of this fulfillment, you would root it in the fall of Rome.
Which, as we know, was around the 5th century.
And you would do that collectively. You would not separate out this tribe, this tribe, this tribe as four.
Right.
You would say collectively it's one second trumpet.
Yep.
But it has at least some final last day applications when there's
in chapter 17, yeah.
On Revelation 17. Okay, well, we're to the end. And Ganem, it has been wonderful to have you. I hope you've enjoyed it. You sit as a student like me. We're learning.
Very educational.
Yeah. So we'll do it again. We're down to the end. This is GPS. Please come back next week.